They called it buried, but the Sowder family knew better. In the winter of 1886, shovels in hand, they marched to the old crossroads above Ackert's Mill, ready to exhume what the entire Missouri Ozarks had sworn to forget. What they found shattered them. By spring, 4 of the 6 Sowders were simply gone. Not buried, not run off, but vanished in a way no survivor could ever articulate. The 2 remaining would never utter a full sentence again. Taney County sealed the road they opened, packed it tight, and carved a new wagon trail around the cursed spot, then wiped the settlement's name from every map, ceding it to the trees. For almost 140 years, the story stayed in the ground with everything else. This is what the Sowders family dug up, and why the people who buried it were right to be afraid. To understand what happened at that crossroads, you have to understand the Sowders themselves, because nobody would have called them careless people. Elias Sowders had come up from Arkansas in the 1870s with a wife named Ada, and he had picked the worst 40 acres in the valley on purpose, because it was the only land the older families would not fight him for. It sat high on a shoulder of rock above the mill, thin soil over limestone, good for almost nothing. Elias made it work anyway. He and Ada raised 4 children on that ridge, 2 boys, Thomas and young Elias, and 2 girls, Ruth and the youngest, a quiet child named Verna, who the neighbors remembered mostly because she never cried. Not even as an infant. The family kept to themselves, traded honestly, and asked nobody for anything. In a hollow full of feuds and grudges, the Sowders were the family with no enemies, which is part of why what they did made no sense too. To these were careful, God-fearing hill folk who had survived on that ridge for over a decade, and in a single winter they threw it all away to dig at the one spot the entire valley had agreed to leave alone. So, what was down there for that? We go back one more year to the summer before, when it was first put into the ground. In the summer of 1885, a crew was widening the trail where it crossed the low ground near the mill. Men had graded that stretch for 2 generations. But when they dug down past the old wagon ruts, past the layer of river gravel everyone expected, their spades hit something that was not supposed to be there. It was stone, cut stone, not the rough limestone of the hills, but dressed blocks fitted so tightly together that a knife blade would not pass between them, laid in a pattern that curved away under the hill in both directions. The men followed it for most of a day before they understood what they were standing on. It was not a wall, it was the top of something. An arch or a doorway buried so deep that no living person in the county had ever heard it mentioned. The oldest man on the crew, a grader named Josiah Reed, told the others to stop. He had heard his grandfather speak once about the old ground below the mill, about how the first families had found things there they did not build, and the decision everyone after them was expected to honor. You did not open the ground below Ackert's mill. You covered what surfaced, you marked it, and you walked away. The crew argued, but that night, one of the younger men who had climbed down into the cut did not come back to camp the same. And by the end of that week, the county had made its choice. They filled the trench, sealed the stone, and buried the doorway under 6 feet of packed clay and river rock. Then they wrote it into the record and closed the book. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the town buried beneath that crossroads. The names and dates of the 7 men who sealed the doorway. The county's own written reasoning for covering the ground. The survivor's account of the second night word for word. I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen now. Let us continue. Here is the part that matters. The Sowders were not on that crew. Elias Sowders had no part in the digging, no part in the sealing, and, by every account, he never went near the low ground that whole year. So, how did a careful family that stayed out of everyone's business end up out there in the dead of winter, tearing open the one place the valley had forbidden? The answer is that somebody talked. Over that year, the story of the buried doorway did not stay sealed the way the stone did. It leaked out at the meeting house and the mill in pieces, and each retelling added to it. By the time it reached the Sowders Ridge, the story was no longer about a strange arch that frightened a work crew. It was about treasure. People said the old builders had left more than a doorway down there. They said there was a chamber behind the stone, and in the chamber there was metal, gold, some claimed. Others said it was something stranger, older, worth more than gold to the right buyer. And the county, the story went, had not sealed the ground out of fear. They had sealed it out of greed to keep it for themselves. For a family scraping a living off 40 acres of rock, that rumor was a slow poison. The winter of 1885 into 86 was a hard one. The Sowders' fall harvest had failed. Ada had taken sick, and Elias, the careful man who had never asked anyone for anything, began to sit up at night doing arithmetic that never came out in his favor. What tipped him over? Ruth believed was not the money at all. It was the sickness. Ada was not getting better, and there was no doctor closer than a full day's ride, and a man watching his wife fade. While he sits on 40 acres of worthless rock, will start to believe almost anything about a chamber full of gold 4 miles down the road. Elias never told his children they were going to steal. He told them they were going to save their mother. That was the shape of the lie he needed, and it was the one Verna would use against him in the dark. We know from the 2 survivors, pieced together over the years, roughly how it began. On a night in late January, when the moon was down and the snow had crusted hard enough to walk on without leaving deep tracks, Elias woke his 2 sons and his oldest daughter, Ruth. He left Ada sick in bed, and for reasons no one has ever explained, he brought the youngest, Verna, along, too. She was 11 years old. They took 2 lanterns, a pick, and 3 shovels, and they walked the 4 miles down to the crossroads in the cold. The clay the county had packed over. The stone had frozen hard, but the Sowders were hill farmers who had broken rock their whole lives. They worked in shifts through the dark, and by the first gray light, they had reached the top of the dressed stone. The cold that night was the kind that kills men who stop moving. But Ruth said none of them felt it once they reached the stone. If anything, the ground gave off a faint warmth, the way a banked fire does hours after it has gone out. And the closer they dug to the seam of the door, the less any of them wanted to be the one standing nearest to it. Ruth, who was one of the two who lived, said that the moment the lantern light touched the cut blocks, Verna stopped working. The girl stood at the edge of the pit and looked down and said, very calmly, that there was someone on the other side of the stone who had been waiting a long time for the door to open, and she said it was glad. Nobody answered her. Ruth said that was the thing she remembered most clearly out of the whole night, worse than anything that came later. Not one of them told the little girl she was talking nonsense, because every one of them, standing in that frozen pit with the lantern light on the cut stone, had already felt the same thing she was describing. A patience and attention, something on the far side of the door that had noticed them digging and was in no hurry at all. Elias told her to hush and keep digging. They found the seam of the doorway just after dawn, and then, because the light was coming up and people used the trail by day, Elias made the decision that ended his family. He filled the top of the pit loosely with brush and snow, covered the lanterns, and told them all they would come back the next night to finish, to open it. Ruth begged him not to. She was the oldest, 16 that winter, old enough to know that whatever was down there was not treasure and not for them. She told her father they should fill the pit and never speak of it, and let the county keep its secret. Elias listened to her the whole walk home, and he did not argue, and Ruth thought for a few hours that she had won. She had not. By then the choice was not really his anymore. They walked home in daylight, 4 miles back up to the ridge, and spent the day pretending to Ada that nothing was wrong. But something had already come back with them. Ruth said, the house felt crowded that day in a way she could not explain, as if the rooms had more corners than they used to. Verna would not eat, and when the sun went down, the youngest Sowders child was already standing at the door with her coat on, waiting, because, she said, the person behind the stone did not like to be kept waiting twice. Before we move on to what they found on the second night, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Sowders family and the thing behind the stone is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county record, the burial order, the exhumation date. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. The QR code is on your screen. The second night was the 29th of January, 1886. This time, Elias did not tell his family to be quiet on the walk down. Ruth said. Her father had stopped talking almost entirely by then, and that all of them walked in a straight line, without lanterns, following Verna, who knew the way in the dark without being shown. They cleared the brush and reached the doorway again a little after midnight. And this is where the account from the two survivors becomes difficult, because neither of them agreed on the order of what happened next, and both of them, when they tried to describe it in later years, would begin to shake and stop. What they agreed on is this: Elias put his pick into the seam of the door and pried, and the stone did not break the way stone breaks. It opened. It swung inward on the far side, with a sound like a long breath being let out, and the air that came up out of the ground was warm. In the dead of a Missouri January, warm. It smelled, Ruth said, like a room where a great many people had been sleeping. Thomas, the older son, was closest to the opening, and he went down into it first with a lantern, and the light went down and did not stop. There was no chamber. There was no treasure. There was a stairway of the same dressed stone going down under the hill, further than the lantern could reach, and the walls of it were covered edge to edge in carving, not writing that anyone could read, faces. Rows and rows of human faces, thousands of them. And Ruth said that as the lantern passed, the faces at the edge of the light seemed to turn to follow it. Thomas called back up that he could hear something below. Then he stopped calling. The lantern light kept going down without him, steady, as if someone had taken it from his hand and was carrying it deeper. And Verna, standing at the top of the stair, said in her calm little voice that Thomas was staying, and that he wanted them to know he was not afraid, and that there was so much room down there, room for the whole valley, room for everyone the world had ever buried and forgotten. Elias reached the end of himself right there. He grabbed the two nearest children, Ruth and young Elias, and hauled them back from the pit. But when he turned for Verna, she was already 3 steps down the stair, walking calmly into the dark after her brother, and she did not look back. Ruth said. The last she saw of her little sister was the pale shape of her going down, and the faces on the walls leaning after her. Elias did not go in after her. To the end of her life, Ruth believed that was the moment her father's mind broke, not from what he saw, but from what he chose. He left one child in the ground to save the other 2. He filled that pit in a frenzy, threw the shovels in, threw the pick in, pushed frozen clay down onto the open door with his bare hands, and he did not stop until the ground was level, and there was nothing to show a family had ever stood there. Then he took Ruth and young Elias home. And here is the part that the valley never forgave and never forgot. Ada, the mother, was still sick in that house. And when Elias came through the door before dawn with 2 of his 4 children and no explanation, Ada asked where Thomas and Verna were. And Elias could not answer. He sat down at the table, and he did not get up for 3 days, and he never spoke another clear word for the rest of his life. By the 2nd week of February, the neighbors knew something was wrong on the Sowders ridge. Smoke from the chimney at odd hours. Nobody coming down to the mill. And when 2 men from the meeting house finally rode up to check on the family, they found Ada gone. Not dead, gone the same as the others. Her bed was made and her shawl was on the hook, and there was no sign she had walked out into the snow. There were only 3 Sowders left in that house now. A father who could not speak, and 2 children who would not. The men who found them understood immediately what must have happened, because they were valley men and they knew about the ground below the mill. And this is the part of the story that separates it from an ordinary tragedy. The town did not call the law. They did not write to Springfield. They handled it the way the first families had handled it, the old way, the way that had kept the valley alive for 2 generations. A group of men, 7 of them, went back down to the crossroads with fresh stone and mortar and lime. And they opened the top of the Sowders pit just far enough to reach the doorway. And Ruth, who was made to watch so that the last child would carry the warning forward, said they worked all day and would not let a single one of their own go down more than an arm's length into the cut. They sealed the door not with clay this time, with mortared stone and lime and iron bar and words spoken over it that Ruth never repeated to anyone. Then they buried it deeper than the county ever had, and they broke the road, and they bent the trail around it in that wide, senseless curve, and they let Acres Mill die. Ruth never forgot the sound the door made when the second seal went home, not the scrape of stone. Underneath it, she said, there was a low sound from far down the stair that rose and rose until the last block dropped into place and cut it off. She would not say what the sound was. When her granddaughter pressed her, the old woman only said, it was the same sound a house makes when everyone inside it has been told to be quiet and is trying. Within 5 years, the mill was gone. The meeting house was gone, and the families had scattered to other hollows and other counties, carrying the rule with them and passing it down in the careful indirect way hill people pass down the things that frighten them. Do not dig below the mill. Do not open the old ground. If it surfaces, cover it and walk away. Elias Sowders lived another 11 years in the care of a cousin, silent the whole time. Young Elias, the son, left Missouri as soon as he was grown and never came back. Only Ruth stayed, and only Ruth talked, and even then, only near the end of her life to a granddaughter who wrote it down because she did not know what else to do with it. That account is where almost everything we have comes from. And she was careful to write that Ruth never once claimed to understand it. Ruth did not know who built the stair. She did not know what was carved into the walls, or what took her brother, or what her little sister walked down to meet. She knew only what her family had done, and what the valley had done after, and that both of them had been the same thing, covering the ground, walking away. Now, here is where this story stops being just a piece of Ozark folklore and starts asking a much harder question. Because the thing under Acres Mill was not a grave. Graves do not have staircases. Graves are not fitted from dressed stone by hands that could carve 10,000 faces into a wall. Whatever the Sowders opened was built. It was engineered. And it was already ancient and already buried when the first American families reached that valley in the early 1800s. So, who built it. The official history has one answer for every hill and hollow in this country. Nothing was here. Wilderness, native peoples who left no stone architecture, and then us. But the ground keeps giving up things that do not fit that story. Cut stone under the roads, structures under the hills, doorways that go down instead of up, into a world that the people who found it were so frightened of that they chose to bury it rather than explain it. The Tartaria questions is really just that observation taken seriously. What if there was an older world here, a built world, one that was covered over by mud, by clay, by decisions like the one made at Acres Mill? What if the reason our history begins so abruptly, with empty land and no past, is that the past was put in the ground on purpose by people who opened a door once, saw what was waiting on the other side of it, and understood that some things are buried because burying them is the only mercy left. The Sowders were careful people. They were not fools or liars. They dug up what the town buried because they were told it was treasure, and they found out, too late for 4 of them, what the treasure actually was. A door, a stair, a room with space for everyone the world has ever forgotten, and a patient thing on the other side that had been waiting a very long time for a careful family to come along and let it out. The county sealed that road 3 times over 3 generations. Someone, somewhere, is still keeping that map blank on purpose. And if you have ever driven a back road in the Ozarks and hit curve that bends for no reason you can see, around low ground where the trail should have run straight, you might want to ask what the road is bending around and why nobody ever fixed it. If you want the parts that could not fit in this video, the names, the dates, the county's own words for what they did and why, the full document is linked below. Watch the next one on the screen now, and do not dig below the mill.